In 1955, Raymond Aron sat in Paris, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in the world, and watched them systematically lose the ability to think. Not their intelligence was intact. What they were losing was something more specific and more damaging. The capacity to look at a structure they lived inside and see it for what it was. Aron could see it. He'd spent 15 years trying to explain what he saw. And the response he received from Sartre, from the editors of Le Monde, from the entire Parisian intellectual class, wasn't a refutation. It was something quieter and more effective than a refutation. It was social exclusion. You could be wrong about Aron's argument and still belong. If you agreed with it, you were already outside. He wrote it down anyway. The book was called The Opium of the Intellectuals. And the diagnosis he offered in 1955, for a particular way that intelligent people lose the ability to see the systems they inhabit, is the most precise tool I know of for understanding what's happening to you right now, every time you open your phone. This is not a video about big tech having a political agenda. That framing, whatever its merits, leaves you looking for a villain. What Aron gave us is something more useful, the ability to look at a structure and understand what it will inevitably produce. Not because anyone designed it to produce that, but because of what the structure is. Systems don't need intent to have consequences. They just need to run. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at what Aron actually diagnosed in 1955. We're going to follow that diagnosis forward 70 years. And by the end, you're going to hold a tool that lets you see any information system, including the one in your pocket, for exactly what it is. Not with anger, with clarity. We'll get to why this works on intelligent people who know better. We'll get there. Aron's argument in The Opium of the Intellectuals begins with a word he borrows from Marx. Marx had written that religion was the opium of the people, the sedative that kept the working class from seeing their own exploitation clearly. Aron's inversion is precise and deliberately ironic. The Marxist political project had itself become a religion, and its primary congregation wasn't the working class. It was the intellectuals. He wasn't saying this as an insult, he was saying it as a structural observation. Look at what a religion requires, he said. A prophet who delivers a revelation that explains history. Sacred texts that interpret the prophet's vision for the present. An elect, a group who holds the true understanding and is therefore on the right side of history. An enemy who represents everything the salvation narrative requires to remain coherent. An eschatology, a moment when history arrives at its destination and the long struggle ends. Marxist intellectual culture in 1950s. Paris had all of these. The prophet was Marx. The sacred texts were Capital and the Manifesto, but also the party journals that extended the revelation into the present. The elect were the progressive intellectuals who understood. The enemy was obvious. The eschatology was the revolution that would arrive, always just over the horizon, its perpetual imminence keeping the structure alive. Aron wasn't arguing that this was wrong because it was Marxist. He was arguing that it was dangerous because of what it was structurally. A secular religion. And here's the specific point he kept returning to, the one that matters for what we're building toward. A real religion has something above it, a God, a transcendent moral order, something external to the structure itself that can pass judgment on what the structure does in pursuit of its own logic. When there is nothing above the system, when the system's own internal values are the only values, there is no limit. The system will do whatever its logic requires, and there is no authority capable of saying this far and no further. Without that limit, Aron wrote, the people who claim to act in history's name don't stop. That's the machine. And the machine doesn't stop, because the machine has no mechanism for stopping itself. He tried to say this to people who were brilliant, who had read everything, who were not stupid. And the response was not engagement with the argument. The response was social. You could feel it in whose dinner table invitations stopped coming, in which journals stopped returning correspondence, in the particular silence that falls in a room when someone says the unsayable thing too clearly. The historian Tony Judt, writing about Aron decades later, called it the price of lucidity. It is a real price. Aron paid it for years. Now, hold that structure in your mind for a moment. The secular religion, the system without a ceiling, the social cost of seeing it clearly, and follow me forward 70 years. In 2021, a set of internal Facebook documents became public. They came to be called the Facebook Papers, and they were reported in detail by the Wall Street Journal and a consortium of other outlets. What they showed was this. Facebook's own data scientists had identified in their own internal research that the newsfeed algorithm was systematically amplifying content that produced anger and moral outrage. Not because anyone had programmed it to produce anger, because anger turned out to be the most engagement-efficient emotion on the platform. Angry posts got more reactions, more comments, more shares, more time on screen. The algorithm wasn't designed to radicalize anyone. It was designed to maximize engagement. Radicalization was a structural output of a system optimizing for a single value. Here is the part that matters most. The data scientists flagged this. They wrote memos, they documented the finding, they presented it internally, and the architecture was not changed, because changing it would reduce engagement. The system's internal logic, engagement, overrode the human ethical judgment of the engineers who built it. The people inside the machine could see what the machine was producing and could not stop it, because nothing above the machine's own logic had the authority to say stop. You understand what just happened there? Aron gave you the instrument to read it. There was no God above the algorithm. There was no principle external to engagement that could hold the engagement optimization system accountable. The system ran its logic. The logic produced its output. And the people inside it, well-meaning, intelligent, technically sophisticated people, could not override the structure they were inside. Just as the brilliant people in 1950s, Paris could not override the structure they were inside, not without a cost most of them weren't willing to pay. This is not a conspiracy theory. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the whole point. A conspiracy requires intent, a group of people who have decided to do something and coordinate to do it. What Aron's analysis describes is something more insidious and, in its way, more difficult to address. A system that produces a specific outcome by structural logic, without anyone having chosen that outcome as a goal. The engineers at Facebook were not trying to radicalize American politics, they were trying to maximize engagement. The radicalization was what happened when you ran the engagement logic without a ceiling. That distinction between deliberate intention and structural output is the difference between a problem you can solve by firing the right people and a problem that persists after everyone has been replaced, because the problem is the architecture. The machine doesn't care who's running it. Strip off the labels and it doesn't disappear, it just keeps running. Eli Pariser named a related piece of this in 2011. His book, The Filter Bubble, documented something he'd discovered while comparing what two friends saw when they searched the same term on Google. They got different results. Personalization algorithms had already begun to build distinct information environments around each user, not based on what was true, but based on what each user had previously engaged with. The algorithm was learning what you liked and feeding you more of it. The result, Pariser argued, was an epistemically closed environment, a bubble in which the information you received had been pre-filtered to match your existing preferences and therefore to confirm them. That was 2011, 15 years ago. The architecture didn't contract after the warning. It expanded. Every major platform refined its personalization logic. The engagement optimization models became more sophisticated. The filter bubbles became more precise. And the emotional amplification Aron's instrument would predict from any system running without a ceiling became more measurable and better documented. By 2018, Zeynep Tufekci was writing in the MIT Technology Review about what she called YouTube's radicalization pipeline, the documented tendency of YouTube's recommendation algorithm to route viewers toward progressively more extreme content, because extremity correlated with watch time, and watch time was the system's internal value. YouTube's own engineers acknowledged the pattern in 2019, and the company made some adjustments. The adjustments reduced the most dramatic radicalization pathways somewhat. The underlying architecture, the engagement optimization logic with engagement as its ceiling, remained. Now here is the question I said we'd come back to, the one I want you to sit with for a moment before we get to the answer. Why does this work on intelligent people? You are not a credulous person. The audience that finds its way to this kind of content is, in my experience, exactly the opposite. People who have spent decades reading carefully, thinking carefully, watching events carefully, and drawing conclusions that have held up over time better than the conclusions of people who were far more celebrated. You've earned your skepticism, and yet, and I suspect you feel this if you're honest about it, you've had the experience of opening your phone and closing it 30 minutes later feeling worse about the country than when you opened it, more anxious, more convinced that the other side is not just wrong, but actively malevolent. more certain that things are deteriorating faster than you'd thought, more isolated. And then you go outside or you sit down to dinner and things are roughly as they were. The neighbor is still decent. The local institution is still functioning. The grandchildren are complicated but real and present, not abstractions. The world the phone showed you and the world you inhabit don't match. Why does the phone's version keep winning? Before you get to the intellectual's survival kit, which is where these 7 frameworks live in their applied, printable form, including the engagement ceiling test that maps this exact mechanism onto real conversations. Let me give you the core of the answer, because this is where Aron's instrument does its sharpest work. The system doesn't need your consent. It only needs your engagement. That sounds simple. It isn't. Think about what it means. A system that required your consent to shape your political cognition would be legible to you. You'd see it asking. You'd have the option to decline. A system that requires only your engagement operates below the threshold of consent. It doesn't persuade you that the content is accurate. It doesn't need to. It only needs to keep you looking. And the content that keeps people looking longest, the content that produces the highest engagement, is content that activates threat response. Fear, anger, moral outrage. The sense that something precious is being destroyed, and you're the only one who sees it. Your threat response is not a character flaw. It is a feature of human neurology that served you well for hundreds of thousands of years. The algorithm didn't create it. The algorithm found it, measured it, and learned to activate it with increasing precision, because activation kept you on the platform, and keeping you on the platform was the only value the system was optimizing for. Intelligent people fall for it not because they're not intelligent, but because intelligence is not a defense against a system that bypasses the cognitive layer entirely and operates directly on the threat response layer. The brilliant people in 1950s Paris were not failing because they'd stopped thinking. They were inside a system that rewarded a particular kind of thinking. The thinking that kept you in the elect, that maintained your social position, that kept the dinner invitations coming, and that made a different kind of thinking very expensive. The system didn't need to defeat their arguments. It only needed to make the social cost of disagreement high enough that the argument was never seriously engaged. Your phone is doing something structurally identical, with different variables. It doesn't threaten your dinner invitations. It activates your threat response until the world inside the phone feels more real and more urgent than the world outside it. You don't consent to this. You just look, and looking is enough. That is the machine. That is the structure. And here is the inversion that I think Aron would have found both grimly amusing and exactly predicted. The people who built this structure were not trying to radicalize anyone. They were trying to build something their users loved. The Facebook data scientists who flagged the anger amplification problem were troubled by what they found. The YouTube engineers who documented the radicalization pipeline were not celebrating it. They were, in their own way, people like the intellectuals Aron sat among in Paris. Intelligent, well-meaning people inside a structure whose logic was running past what their own ethical judgment could stop. The structure didn't need them to intend the outcome. It only needed them to keep the system running. This is not an excuse, it is a diagnosis. And diagnoses are more useful than verdicts, because a verdict tells you who to blame, and a diagnosis tells you what is actually happening. What do you do with this? Aron's own answer, characteristically, was not a program. He didn't offer 12 steps or a manifesto. What he offered, and what I think is genuinely useful, not merely elegant, was a position. He called it something like a modest hope. The recognition that the free world we inherited is imperfect, is not permanent, and is worth defending with open eyes rather than with the certainty of people who have stopped being able to see it. The position is not optimism. Aron was too clear-eyed for optimism in the cheap sense. But it is not despair either, and it is emphatically not the activated, anxious, grievance-amplified state that the engagement optimization system is designed to produce and sustain in you. The position is clarity, the ability to see the structure for what it is, not to be inside it, mistaking its emotional weather for your own judgment. The practical version of this, as I apply Aron's framework to the specific problem of your information diet, is something like this. Every information system has an internal logic. The question Aron asked of Marxist intellectual culture: what is the value this system is actually optimizing for? And what is above it that can say, this far and no further? Minus is the question you can now ask of every system you inhabit. What is the New York Times optimizing for? What is Fox News optimizing for? What is your church's communications Strategy optimizing for. What is the group chat optimizing for? These are not rhetorical questions designed to produce cynicism about everything. They are diagnostic questions that produce clarity about specific things. A system optimizing for subscriptions has a different structural logic than a system optimizing for engagement, and both are different from a system optimizing for accuracy. The outputs will differ accordingly. Aron's instrument doesn't tell you to trust nothing. It tells you to understand what each system is built to produce, and to read its outputs accordingly. The filter bubble is real. The anger amplification is documented. The engagement optimization logic runs without a ceiling on every major platform you use. You didn't consent to the architecture. You inherited it the way Aron's generation inherited the intellectual architecture of a post-war Paris organized around a structure that was running its own logic without limit. He named it. He wrote it down. He paid a social cost for doing it, and he did it anyway. The name made it possible to see. Named things can be responded to. Unnamed things only wound. The question I'll leave you with, not the one this video answered, but the smaller, harder one underneath it, is this. Now that you can see the structure, what kind of witness do you want to be inside it? The algorithm is still running. It will be running tomorrow morning when you wake up. The question is whether you're the same person who opens the phone or someone different. Someone who sees the machine before the machine sees them. Tell me about the moment you first noticed that opening your phone made the world feel more dangerous than it actually was. I read these. The Intellectual's Survival Kit. 7 frameworks from Aron that work in any argument is in the description. 7 frameworks designed for printing and use. The Secular Religion Checklist, the Engagement Ceiling Test, the Liberty Equality Antinomy Map, the Modest Hope Position Finder, the Institutional Capture Radar, and 2 others, each with a sample conversation showing it in use. The link is in the description.